The most dangerous man in Canadian history didn't come from the military. He didn't come from the streets. He came from the boardrooms of central banks, the gilded halls of Davos, and the quiet corridors of Geneva climate summits. And for 15 years, he built something that no elected government ever authorized, no parliament ever approved, and no voter ever sanctioned: a $130 trillion financial empire designed to quietly rewire the rules of the global economy from the inside. Mark Carney thought he was untouchable. He thought the architecture was too complex to dismantle, the coalition too large to fracture, and the network too deep to sever. He was wrong. Washington just proved it. J.D. Vance didn't send a diplomat. He didn't schedule a summit. He sent a document. And that document didn't ask, it demanded. And the man who wanted to redesign global money is now fighting to save his own country from economic destruction. To understand why Washington just fired a political missile directly at Mark Carney, you have to understand what Carney actually built. Because what he built was never just a climate initiative. It was a system, a parallel architecture of financial power, so carefully constructed, so institutionally embedded, and so deliberately insulated from democratic accountability that by the time most people noticed it existed, it had already become load-bearing infrastructure for the global economy. Carney did not stumble into influence. He engineered it with the precision of a man who understood that real power in the modern world doesn't sit in parliaments or presidential offices. Real power sits in the institutions that decide where capital flows. And Carney spent the better part of 2 decades positioning himself at the exact center of that decision-making universe. It started with the Bank of Canada. When the 2008 global financial crisis detonated across world markets and left most central banking establishments scrambling in visible panic, Carney navigated Canada through the wreckage with surgical composure that made international headlines. Canada emerged from the crisis with its banking system intact, its currency stable, and its reputation elevated, while the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Eurozone were still counting casualties. That performance made Carney a global name in every financial center that mattered. What came next was unprecedented. He crossed the Atlantic and took the helm of the Bank of England, a foreigner leading one of the oldest and most prestigious financial institutions on the planet. No one had done it before. The appointment alone signaled something important. Carney had transcended national identity in the eyes of the global financial establishment. He wasn't just Canadian anymore. He was institutional. He belonged to the architecture itself. 2 G7 central banks, 1 man. But Carney wasn't finished. Not even close. When he departed the Bank of England in 2020, he didn't retreat into a comfortable advisory role or collect board seats. He went to war, specifically on behalf of a vision, the idea that the global financial system could be redirected, re-engineered, and repurposed to drive the climate transition without waiting for dysfunctional political systems to catch up. He became the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. And then he did something that no climate advocate, no central banker, and no international official had ever managed at scale. He built GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. What GFANS represented was not a pledge or a statement of intent, it was a coordination mechanism. And the distinction matters enormously. Carney understood that individual institutions making individual commitments to net zero targets produced noise. What produced signal was synchronized movement. If enough of the world's largest financial institutions committed simultaneously to aligning their portfolios with net zero by 2050, the market itself would be restructured around that commitment. Capital would flow away from fossil fuel projects not because of legislation, but because the institutions controlling that capital had agreed to move together. The numbers were staggering. Over 450 financial institutions, including banks, insurers, and asset managers across major Western economies, controlling a combined $130 trillion in assets, larger than the GDP of every nation on Earth combined. Carney had not just built a climate initiative, he had built the largest coordinated private capital coalition in human history, entirely outside any electoral process, legislative chamber, or democratic mandate. This is the precise detail that detonated Washington's response. Because what Carney constructed with GFANS was not, in the eyes of the Vance-aligned administration, merely a financial alliance. It was a governance structure, a shadow parliament of capital capable of influencing American jobs, energy infrastructure, and industrial policy without a single American voter casting a vote. When American banks inside GFANS began redirecting lending away from oil and gas, that was American economic policy being shaped in Geneva conference rooms. When asset managers voted against fossil fuel expansion at shareholder meetings of U.S. energy companies, that was industrial strategy being dictated by an unelected coalition. The administration's position is simple. If you control the flow of capital, you control investment decisions. If you control investment, you control industries. If you control industries, you control the economy itself. From Washington's perspective, Carney was exercising governance over the American economy without authorization or accountability. That accusation gains weight when examining outcomes. Energy prices in Canada and the United Kingdom surged by over 40% in a 3-year window. Manufacturing output in energy-intensive regions declined sharply as production became increasingly unviable under tightening green compliance frameworks. Meanwhile, China expanded coal capacity, India increased fossil fuel consumption, and emerging markets were largely untouched by the net zero constraints imposed on Western financial systems. The asymmetry became central to Washington's argument. The West was absorbing the cost of decarbonization while competitors continued to industrialize using fossil fuels. Then Carney transitioned from unelected architect to elected leader of Canada. That did not reduce his influence in Washington's eyes. It amplified it. Now he had a G7 seat, national authority, and continued access to global financial networks. The ultimatum arrived. 3 demands, non-negotiable. The first demand, the immediate dismantling of ESG mandates being enforced through GFA-NS-linked financial institutions. ESG frameworks were not merely guidelines. They functioned as the operating system of capital allocation, determining which industries were investable and which were systematically restricted. The second demand, full and transparent disclosure of all lobbying activity conducted by GFA-NS-linked organizations inside the United States, particularly efforts to influence climate legislation, financial regulation, and carbon pricing frameworks. The third demand, Canadian withdrawal from international digital currency coordination frameworks, perceived as a strategic challenge to US dollar dominance in global trade settlement. This final demand reveals the real core of the conflict. It is not only about climate policy, it is about the future architecture of money itself. Years earlier, at Jackson Hole in 2019, Carney publicly argued that the US dollar's dominance created systemic imbalance in the global economy and proposed a synthetic digital reserve currency managed by a coalition of central banks. The goal was to gradually reduce global dependence on the dollar and distribute monetary power across a multilateral framework. Washington did not forget that proposal. They cataloged it, analyzed it, and ultimately interpreted it not as theory, but as intent. From that perspective, GFA-NS was never just climate infrastructure. It was dual-use financial architecture capable of supporting a post-dollar monetary order. The response was already in motion before the ultimatum was formally delivered. Major financial institutions began exiting GFA-NS. Regulatory scrutiny increased, political pressure mounted, and without American institutional capital, the $130 trillion figure that defined GFA-NS collapsed in credibility. Because that number always depended on one assumption, that the United States would remain inside the system, or at least neutral. That assumption is now gone. Carney now faces a structural trap. Compliance would dismantle the system he built. Defiance would risk economic consequences for the country he now leads. But there may be a third option, one Washington has not fully anticipated, because beneath the surface of this confrontation, a counter-architecture may already exist, quietly developed long before this conflict became visible. If that is true, then Washington may not have contained the threat. It may have activated it. This is not a policy disagreement. It is a struggle over the future of global money itself. And it is happening right now. But what Washington failed to fully appreciate is that networks like GFA-NS were never built as static structures. They were designed as adaptive systems, capable of rerouting influence, absorbing shocks, and surviving partial fragmentation. Even as major American institutions began withdrawing under political pressure, the underlying framework did not simply collapse. It shifted. Inside Carney's inner circle, the exit of Wall Street banks was not interpreted as defeat. It was treated as filtration. The system, in their internal logic, was never meant to rely permanently on politically volatile capital. The true backbone had already been diversified years earlier into sovereign wealth funds, European pension systems, Asian development banks, and a growing layer of non-American asset managers who were less exposed to Washington's regulatory reach. What looked like a collapse from the outside was, from the inside, a controlled shedding of compromised notes. At the same time, something unexpected began happening in parallel. As the pressure campaign intensified, several mid-tier financial institutions that had quietly withdrawn from GFANS started re-engaging through secondary channels. Not publicly, not through formal announcements, but through climate-aligned investment desks, ESG side agreements, and restructured sustainability mandates that avoided direct labeling. The architecture was re-entering through the back doors of compliance frameworks Washington had not fully sealed. This was the first sign that the ultimatum had triggered not consolidation, but adaptation. In Ottawa, Carney did not respond publicly at first. That silence was strategic. Every word spoken at this stage would have been interpreted not as explanation, but as alignment. Instead, internal coordination intensified. Advisory teams spanning central banking veterans, climate finance architects, and geopolitical strategists began mapping scenarios that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. The central question was no longer how to preserve GFANS in its original form, but how to preserve its functional influence under conditions of open hostility from the United States. One scenario involved partial decentralization, reconstituting GFANS linked coordination under regionally autonomous clusters that would operate independently but remain algorithmically synchronized through shared disclosure standards and capital alignment protocols. In practice, this would create the appearance of fragmentation while preserving directional unity in investment flows. Another scenario explored deeper integration with multilateral development banks, embedding net zero criteria into the lending conditions of institutions that were structurally insulated from U.S. domestic politics. But the most consequential proposal being discussed was something far more subtle, a shift away from explicit climate framing altogether. Instead of net zero targets, the focus would move toward risk stabilization accounting, a language of financial resilience, supply chain security, and macroeconomic stability. This reframing would allow the same capital constraints to persist, but under terminology that could not be easily targeted as ideological or politically coordinated. In other words, the system would become harder to name and therefore harder to attack. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts began noticing something that complicated their initial assumptions. The more pressure applied to visible GFANS structures, the more influence appeared to migrate into adjacent financial systems that were not formally part of the alliance. Insurance risk models began adjusting climate exposure assumptions independently. Credit rating methodologies started incorporating transition risk without direct coordination. Even commodity pricing forecasts in certain institutional circles began reflecting similar long-term decarbonization trajectories. It became increasingly difficult to determine where GFANS ended and where the broader financial consensus began. That ambiguity itself was becoming a form of power. Inside the administration, this raised an uncomfortable question. If influence persists even after formal dismantling, then what exactly is being fought? A coalition or a paradigm, a network or a shift in how global capital interprets risk? This is where the conflict stopped being about Mark Carney personally. He had become less of an individual actor and more of a symbolic concentration point for a transformation that predated him and would likely outlast him. Removing him from the equation did not reverse the underlying financial logic that had already spread through institutional investment behavior across multiple continents. At the same time, pressure on Canada began to create unintended internal tensions. On one side, the country's deep integration into North American trade made alignment with Washington economically unavoidable. On the other, Canada's own financial institutions were heavily embedded in the same global climate-aligned frameworks now under scrutiny. Carney's dual position, as both national leader and global financial architect, meant that every policy decision risked triggering backlash in one domain or the other. The real constraint was not ideological, it was structural. And as the standoff escalated, another layer emerged that neither side could fully control: time. Capital markets do not wait for political cycles. Investment horizons stretch across decades, while governments operate in election cycles measured in years. The transition embedded within GFANS had already been priced into trillions of dollars of long-term allocations. Reversing it abruptly would not simply require policy change, it would require rewriting expectations already embedded into global valuation models. That is what made the situation so unstable. Washington could disrupt institutions. It could sanction, regulate, and withdraw, but it could not easily erase the forward-looking assumptions already internalized by global capital. And in that gap, between political authority and financial expectation, the real battle was unfolding. Carney, aware of this asymmetry, began operating on a longer horizon. His responses became increasingly focused not on immediate defense, but on maintaining coherence across time. As long as the narrative of transition remained internally consistent within major financial systems, the architecture did not need to remain formally unified. It only needed to remain directionally intact. Washington, meanwhile, was operating on a different assumption, that visible control equals real control, that if institutions are forced to disaffiliate, the system they built will unwind. But systems like this do not unwind cleanly. They dissipate, replicate, and reassemble in altered forms. By the time both sides fully recognized this mismatch in assumptions, the confrontation had already moved beyond its original boundaries. It was no longer about ESG mandates or lobbying disclosures or even currency frameworks. It had become a contest over whether global capital behaves like a tool that can be commanded or a system that, once sufficiently synchronized, begins to behave like an independent force. And that question has no clear endpoint, only escalation, adaptation, and the gradual realization that neither side is operating inside a closed system anymore.